Hey everybody, and welcome to The Year Was, a podcast all about today. I'm your host, Michael Montalvo, and together we take the history train back in time once again to discover what makes today truly unique. For the next few minutes, we continue to gather random nuggets of trivia to make you sound smart, or just drop that little fact that makes others stop and say, hey, who invited you? Like seriously, why are you here? On this episode, we examine the events that occurred today, June 19th. The year was 1865, and on this day, slavery was abolished in the state of Texas and became known as Juneteenth. Now, to talk about Juneteenth, we really need to talk about the Emancipation Proclamation. Abraham Lincoln issued the proclamation on January 1st, 1863, declaring that all persons held as slaves are and henceforth shall be free. But here's the thing about that. The Emancipation Proclamation only applied to states that had seceded from the Union and only promised freedom on the condition of a Union victory during the Civil War. It didn't end slavery, but instead was more of a promise to end slavery. And this captured the hearts and imagination of millions of Americans at the time. And when the Civil War ended on April 9th, 1865, with General Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, this caused a great deal of concern about the future of free black people in the United States. The proclamation didn't guarantee their legal status and really just didn't protect them. And back in those days, news traveled slow. It took over 2 months to hear that Robert E. Lee had surrendered, and over 30 months from the proclamation to freedom. And some people believe that Texan slave owners purposely suppressed that information, theories going from murder of the messenger to the federal government delaying the announcement in order to get another cotton harvest. The real reason for the delay was just that the proclamation wasn't enforceable in the rebel states before the war ended. And so to make a long story short, on June 19th, 1865, Union General Gordon Granger rode into Galveston, Texas, and issued General Order No. 3. The people of Texas are informed that, in accordance with the proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts, and they will not be supported in idleness, either there or elsewhere. So, despite being freed over 2 years prior, slavery had now been officially abolished in Texas. The former slaves were encouraged to stay with their families, but what came next became known as the scatter. And droves of former slaves left the state to find family and a more welcoming environment. But things don't always go well. Some slaves were still not freed, as slave owners were not eager to let go of what they saw as their property. Freed slaves were beaten, lynched, and even murdered. Susan Merritt, a former slave, once recalled, "They would catch freed slaves swimming across the Sabine River and shoot them." When the first anniversary came around and freed slaves tried to celebrate, they faced even more problems: segregation. There were no parks or public places that they were permitted to use. And so in the 1870s, former slaves pulled together $800 and purchased 10 acres of land that they named Emancipation Park, a place you can still visit in Houston, Texas today. Celebrations of the anniversary slowed down going into the 20th century, not because they didn't want to celebrate freedom, but because, and really I tried to find another way to say this, but the article I read quotes Slate magazine, who really put it in a way that I don't know that I could be any better. It's difficult to celebrate freedom when your life is defined by oppression on all sides. It wasn't until the Poor People's March that Juneteenth was brought back into the spotlight. In 1980, Texas became the first state to deem it holiday-worthy. However, it's still not considered or viewed as a federal holiday, despite being celebrated in most states. And that's the shortened version of the story of Juneteenth. That's something that, honestly, I wasn't hugely familiar with, and I don't know that I could really tell you about it before this last week. It's just not something that was a huge thing on my radar. This next story is something I was a little bit more familiar with, but not really by much. The year was 1903, and on this day, Hall of Fame baseball player Lou Gehrig was born. Born in Yorkville as Henry Louis Gehrig, his parents were German immigrants who came to the country only a few years before he was born, and he was actually the only one of 4 children to survive infancy. He grew up in poverty, and his father struggled to stay sober and to keep work, but his mother pushed for Gehrig's education and supported all his athletic pursuits, and from an early age, he showed himself to be a very gifted athlete. After high school, he enrolled at Columbia University, where he studied engineering and pursued football, but also made the baseball team. In one game, he struck out 17 batters, but it was his batting skills that really appealed to the New York Yankees. By his second season with them, he had replaced first baseman Wally Pipp. In April of 1923, they signed him to his first professional contract. He struggled to make friends among his teammates, especially with Babe Ruth, but his hardworking nature earned him the nickname the Iron Horse. In 1938, he experienced his first subpar season, and many assumed that it was his age and his work ethic that had finally begun to catch up with him, but he was fearing something worse. He had begun having difficulty tying his shoes, and after a bad start to the 1939 season, checked himself into the Mayo Clinic. There, after a series of tests, doctors told him he was suffering from amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS. The disease causes the nerve cells to stop interacting with the body's muscles, basically shutting down the body. Now, it was during this time that he had set a record, playing 2,130 consecutive games, a record that came to an end on May 2nd, 1939, when he took himself out of the lineup. What's really cool about this is that that record wasn't broken until 1995. Now, shortly after this, he retired from baseball, but he returned to Yankee Stadium on the 4th of July, where he said, "For the past 2 weeks, you've been reading about a bad break. Today, I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth. I might have been given a bad break, but I have an awful lot to live for. Thank you." Following his retirement, he was immediately inducted into the Hall of Fame, and his number was retired by the Yankees, becoming the first player in baseball to receive that honor. His health continued to deteriorate, and on June 2nd of 1941, he passed away in his sleep. My only real familiarity with Lou Gehrig was the film Pride of the Yankees, which I saw years ago, probably whenever I was still in school. And we all know of ALS because they've really come to call it Lou Gehrig's disease because he brought such attention to it. But a lot of the stuff that I found out about him, I just didn't know. The final topic I want to mention is something a bit fun, and I think you'll enjoy it. The year was 1978, and on this day, the world was first introduced to the lasagna-loving, Monday-hating cat, Garfield. And that's going to do it for us today. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can find the audio version on iTunes, Podbean, Spotify, and Google Play. Actually, I think most podcast apps now will have this. Links in the description for the ones I mentioned. If you like the podcast and you want to hear more, give us a rate and a review. That helps me out and lets me know what direction to keep this going in. And hey, if you liked it, share it with a friend. They might like it too. You can find me on social media and at YouTube at the Apple Cider Club. And if you keep an eye out, we're going to start posting videos coming up here in the next couple of weeks. As always, I want to thank the Tim Kreitz Band for our musical theme, and you for listening. We'll see you next time.